images of valiant knights, towering castles, and epic battles. But behind the romanticized facade lies a darker reality, especially for women. Far from being just damsels in distress, women of this era navigated a labyrinth of trials and tribulations, facing everything from societal constraints to stark humiliations. It wasn't easy being a woman in these rugged times. So join us for today's list as we count down the top 10 messed up things that women in the medieval age went through. Number 10, sexual assault. Sexual assault in the medieval age was a widespread and deeply troubling reality for many women. The legal, social, and cultural attitudes of the time created an environment where sexual violence was not only common, but often accepted and even institutionalized in various forms. During this period, the concept of consent as we understand it today was virtually non-existent. For many women, their bodies were viewed as property, first of their fathers and then of their husbands. This patriarchal view extended to sexual autonomy, or rather the lack thereof. For instance, marital rape was not considered a crime. A husband's access to his wife's body was seen as a marital right, rendering any notion of consent irrelevant. One of the most horrifying practices was the so-called marriage by abduction. This was a legal and socially accepted way for a man to claim a wife by kidnapping her and forcing her into marriage, which was only considered valid after consummation. Essentially rape. High-profile cases involved notable figures such as Theobald Fay, Count of Blois, and Geoffrey, Count of Nantes, who attempted to kidnap Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most eligible woman in Europe at the time. Women of lower social standing were not spared from these brutal practices. In fact, their experiences were often worse due to the lack of social and legal protections. The writings of Andreas Capellanus in the 12th century, for instance, offer a disturbing glimpse into the attitudes of the time. Capellanus advised that peasants considered incapable of true love could be coerced into sexual relations through flattery and force, reflecting a deeply ingrained view of women as mere objects of desire. Legal recourse for rape victims was minimal and fraught with challenges. In some cases, the victim was expected to carry out the punishment herself, such as gouging out the eyes or severing the testicles of the offender. However, such severe actions were rarely enforced, and many cases ended with the rapist merely paying a fine or marrying the victim. This latter outcome was particularly insidious, as it forced the victim into a lifelong bond with her assailant, often to preserve her family's honor or social standing. In certain parts of feudal Europe, the droit du seigneur, or right of the lord, allegedly allowed a feudal lord to have sexual relations with a servant's bride on her wedding night. While the historical accuracy of this practice is debated, its very mention underscores the severe power imbalances and exploitation prevalent in medieval society. Religious institutions also played a role in perpetuating these abuses. The church imposed strict moral codes on women, emphasizing their roles as obedient wives and mothers. Religious texts and teachings often placed the blame for sexual violence on the victims, citing their behavior or appearance as provocation. This not only silenced many women, but also reinforced the notion that they were responsible for the actions of their assailants. Despite these overwhelming odds, there were instances of resistance and reporting. Some women did come forward to report their assaults, and there were recorded cases where justice was sought, albeit through a deeply flawed system. Historical accounts reveal that while some women were taken at their word and their claims investigated, many others faced significant social and legal obstacles, making justice an elusive goal. Number 9, witch hunts. During the medieval period, the fear of witchcraft was rampant. Women were disproportionately targeted, and this hysteria reached its peak between the 15th and 17th centuries. The most infamous trials, like those in Salem, happened later, but the seeds were sown in medieval Europe. The reasons behind these witch hunts were complex, involving a mix of superstition, religious fervor, and societal tensions. The Catholic Church played a significant role in promoting the fear of witches. In 1487, Heinrich Kramer and James Sprenger published Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches, a guide on identifying, interrogating, and executing witches. This book became a bestseller and a handbook for witch hunters across Europe. The methods used to identify witches were as barbaric as they were nonsensical. One common method was the swimming test. Suspected witches were tied up and thrown into water. If they floated, it was believed they were rejecting baptism and were therefore guilty. If they sank, they were considered innocent, but often drowned anyway. Another method was pricking, where the accused was stabbed with needles to find a witch's mark, supposedly a spot that didn't feel pain or bleed. This could be anything from a mole to a birthmark. Once accused, women faced brutal interrogations designed to extract confessions. Torture was commonly used. The rack, where the victim's limbs were slowly pulled apart, and the strappado, where the victim was hoisted by their arms tied behind their back, were among the most horrifying methods. Under such torture, many confessed to anything just to end their suffering. Even without torture, the social pressure and psychological torment were immense. Women accused of witchcraft were ostracized by their communities, and even if they were acquitted, the stigma often remained. Their families suffered too, facing suspicion and exclusion. The trials themselves were far from fair. They often relied on spectral evidence, which was testimony that the spirit or specter of the accused was seen committing witchcraft. This was purely subjective and impossible to disprove. Hearsay, dreams, and rumors could all be used as evidence against the accused. In many cases, the trials were simply a formality before the inevitable execution. Punishments for convicted witches were severe. The most common sentence was death, usually by hanging or burning at the stake. Burning was particularly brutal, chosen because it was believed to purify the soul. These executions were often public spectacles, intended to serve as a warning to others. Women were more vulnerable to accusations for several reasons. They were often the healers, midwives, and herbalists of their communities, roles that involved knowledge of plants and natural remedies. In a superstitious society, this knowledge could easily be seen as witchcraft. Additionally, women who were outspoken, economically independent, or otherwise deviated from societal norms were prime targets. Widows and elderly women who had less protection and were more socially isolated were particularly at risk. The impact of these witch hunts was devastating. Tens of thousands of women were executed, and countless more lived in fear. Communities were torn apart by suspicion and accusation. The witch hunts reinforced patriarchal structures, keeping women subservient and fearful. Number 8. Menstrual taboo. Menstruation was often viewed as a sign of impurity and danger. Menstrual blood was believed to spoil food, cause diseases, and even led to crop failure. Such beliefs were reinforced by influential figures like Albertus Magnus, who described menstrual blood as toxic and harmful. This made menstruating women a subject of fear and suspicion, further isolating them from society. Women were frequently segregated during their menstrual periods, forced to stay away from communal activities and religious practices. They were seen as unclean and had to endure the social exclusion, which exacerbated the stigma surrounding menstruation. In the medieval age, menstruation was often linked to madness and instability. Some medieval texts suggested that women were more prone to emotional and psychological disturbances during their menstrual cycles. This belief pathologized a natural process and provided a convenient excuse to dismiss and control women's voices and actions. Interestingly, the frequency of menstruation was lower for medieval women compared to today. Factors like poor nutrition, hard labor, and prolonged breastfeeding meant that many women experienced fewer menstrual cycles. Despite this, when they did menstruate, the societal reactions and lack of proper care made it a particularly difficult time. The church played a significant role in perpetuating these taboos. Religious authorities often portrayed menstruation as a curse, reinforcing the idea that women were inherently flawed and needed to be controlled. This religious endorsement of menstrual taboos solidified their place in medieval society and ensured their persistence across generations. The lack of proper menstrual hygiene products compounded these issues. Women had to make do with makeshift solutions. They used natural materials like sphagnum moss, which was highly absorbent and helped manage menstrual flow. Sphagnum moss, also known as blood moss, was particularly useful due to its ability to soak up large amounts of fluid. Women also fashioned pads from scrap fabric or rags. Cotton, though rare and expensive, was sometimes used for its superior absorbent qualities. However, linen was more commonly used as it was more accessible. These fabric pads were often held in place with belts or bands, as underwear was not yet widely worn. There is also evidence that some women wore red clothing during their periods to camouflage any accidental stains. Red petticoats and skirts served a dual purpose. They were fashionable and functional, masking any menstrual leaks and reducing the social stigma associated with visible menstrual blood. This practice, however, is still debated among historians, as it may not have been widespread or consistently practiced. In addition to these methods, some medieval women used natural sponges as makeshift tampons. Sea sponges, which were soft and absorbent, were inserted to absorb menstrual flow. In rural areas, women sometimes simply bled into their clothing, relying on the multiple layers of skirts and undergarments to absorb the blood. These materials were uncomfortable and increased the risk of infections. Adding to the physical discomfort of menstruation, the term "on the rag" actually originated from this period, reflecting the primitive methods women used to manage their periods. Number 7. Accusations and punishments for adultery. In many medieval societies, adultery was considered a grave sin and a serious crime, especially when committed by women. Women accused of adultery were subjected to severe and often public punishments. One common punishment was the run. This involved the accused woman being forced to walk or run through the streets, often partially clothed or naked, while a town crier loudly announced her crime. The purpose was to shame her publicly, deterring others from committing the same offense. This practice was prevalent in southern France, where the woman might even be physically abused by onlookers during her walk. In some regions, the punishments were even more severe. Germanic traditions allowed husbands to shave their wives' heads, strip them naked, and flog them through the village if they were caught in adultery. Execution was also a possibility. The right to kill an adulterous wife extended to the husband, and in some cases, her male relatives if they caught her in the act. The church's influence further compounded the severity of these punishments. Canon law strictly condemned extramarital sex, particularly for women. Some women were confined to monasteries for life as a form of penance, a fate often seen as more merciful compared to public shaming and physical punishment. However, many local courts preferred public humiliation to ensure the community witnessed the consequences of adultery. Men involved in adulterous affairs were not always punished as harshly. While women faced severe penalties, men often received lighter punishments unless caught in the act by a cuckolded husband. In such instances, men could face flogging or other forms of corporal punishment, but this was less common. The flimsy nature of these accusations often exacerbated the injustice. Women could be accused of adultery based on mere suspicion or unfounded rumors. These accusations could stem from personal vendettas, jealousy, or simply to discredit a woman. Once accused, proving innocence was nearly impossible, and the social stigma attached to such accusations was devastating. The severity of these punishments was tied to concerns over property and inheritance. Adultery threatened the legitimacy of heirs and consequently the stability of family estates. This concern over paternity and the purity of bloodlines meant that women bore the brunt of the punishments for adultery. Number 6. Lack of legal rights. During the medieval age, women were considered property of their fathers or husbands, severely limiting their autonomy and legal standing. First and foremost, women had virtually no property rights. Upon marriage, a woman's property and wealth were transferred to her husband. This included any land, money, and possessions she might have inherited or earned. The husband had full control over these assets, and the wife had no legal claim to them. If a woman was widowed, she could be left destitute if her husband's will did not provide for her, as the property would often revert to male relatives. Marriage itself was largely a transaction between families, often arranged without the woman's consent. Women were married off to form alliances, consolidate wealth, or gain social status. The bride's primary role was to produce heirs and manage the household. Love and personal choice were rarely considered in these arrangements. In legal matters, women were severely disadvantaged. They could not represent themselves in court, and any legal disputes had to be handled by their male relatives. Women's testimonies were often considered less credible than men's, and in many cases, they were not allowed to testify at all. This lack of legal representation made it nearly impossible for women to seek justice or defend their rights. Divorce was almost unheard of, as marriage was considered a sacrament by the church. Women had little recourse if they were in abusive or unhappy marriages. Annulments were rare and typically required the intervention of the church, often on grounds that reflected poorly on the woman, such as accusations of infertility or immorality. Additionally, women's roles were heavily dictated by societal expectations and religious teachings. The church played a significant role in shaping attitudes towards women, often portraying them as morally weaker and more susceptible to sin. This religious and cultural backdrop justified the legal and social restrictions placed on women, reinforcing the idea that they needed to be controlled and protected by men. Despite these oppressive conditions, some women managed to navigate the legal system to their advantage. Noble women, for example, could wield significant influence through their family connections and marriages. Some women also entered convents, where they could gain a measure of autonomy and engage in intellectual pursuits. However, these were exceptions rather than the norm. Before we move on, here's today's subscriber's pick. This striking image hails from the renowned medieval manuscript Roman de la Rose by Guillaume de Loris and Jean de Meun. Captured here is a vivid depiction of Venus and her lover Mars, ensnared in the throes of adultery. The plot thickens as Vulcan, Venus's husband, ingeniously binds the lovers with a rope, a scene that speaks volumes about the medieval perspectives on fidelity. This image is more than just an artistic expression. It reveals the harsh realities of medieval times where adultery was not just a moral failing, but a severe crime, particularly perilous for women. The consequences they faced could be dire, ranging from public shame to more severe, even lethal penalties. For men like Vulcan, catching a spouse in such an act could grant them significant leeway to exact personal justice, reflecting the intense gender disparities of the era. What do you think about the consequences for adultery in the medieval age? Let us know in the comments section below. Number 5. Forced into nunneries. Imagine being sent away from your family and friends, confined to a life of strict rules and limited freedoms. This was the fate of numerous women during medieval times, driven by various societal and familial pressures. One common reason for forcing women into nunneries was economic necessity. Families with too many daughters and insufficient dowries to marry them all off often saw nunneries as a solution. By sending their daughters to these religious institutions, they reduced the financial burden and ensured their daughters would be cared for, albeit in a cloistered environment. Nunneries provided the best education available to women at that time. Girls, some as young as 7, were sent to these institutions to learn reading, writing, and religious texts. While this might sound beneficial, the reality was often grim. The decision was rarely theirs, and many young girls found themselves separated from their families, with little to no contact with the outside world. Life in a nunnery was far from easy. The daily routine was rigorous, beginning with matins load, the first service of the day at around 2 in the morning, followed by multiple prayer sessions and manual labor throughout the day. Tasks ranged from fieldwork and cooking to embroidery and copying manuscripts. Despite the hard work, some women found a semblance of autonomy and purpose in these tasks, but for many it was a life of unending toil. The reasons behind forcing women into nunneries were not always purely economic. Social and political motives also played significant roles. For instance, noble families sometimes sent their daughters to nunneries to protect their chastity and family honor, or to remove a potential political threat. In some cases, daughters were sent away due to perceived disgrace or to resolve familial conflicts. This practice sometimes led to overcrowding in nunneries. For example, the prioress of Cairo complained in 1273 that powerful lords were forcing their daughters into the convent, exceeding its capacity. The strict environment of nunneries enforced a life of chastity, poverty, and obedience. Nuns wore simple clothing, usually a long tunic and a veil, symbolizing their renunciation of worldly possessions and their commitment to God. Interaction with the outside world was minimal, and leaving the nunnery was nearly impossible without severe consequences. Despite the challenges, some women did find solace and purpose within the convent walls. They engaged in charitable work, education, and even some level of intellectual pursuit. However, the forced nature of their entry into these institutions often overshadowed any positive aspects, leaving many women feeling trapped in a life they did not choose. Number 4. Guild exclusion. Guilds were powerful associations of craftsmen and merchants that regulated trade, maintained quality, and provided social security for their members. However, they also enforced strict rules that kept women from accessing these benefits and opportunities. Guilds typically barred women from becoming full members or masters within their trades. This exclusion meant that women could not officially own businesses, hire apprentices, or participate in the decision-making processes of the guilds. Even in trades where women were highly active, such as textile production, food preparation, and midwifery, guild membership and the associated benefits were largely inaccessible to them. Women often worked alongside men in industries like spinning, weaving, and brewing, but their contributions were undervalued and unrecognized by guilds. When women did manage to work within these trades, it was usually as unskilled laborers or in supportive roles, which offered lower pay and less job security. For example, in the textile industry, women were employed in lower status tasks like spinning and fine needlework, while the more profitable roles in cloth making were dominated by men. There were some exceptions, such as in Paris and Genoa, where specific women's guilds existed for trades like silk production and gold spinning. However, these were rare and did not significantly alter the overall exclusionary practices of most guilds across Europe. Even in these women's guilds, the highest ranks were often held by men, and women still faced significant limitations. Widows had a slightly better chance of participating in guild activities, as they could inherit their husband's business rights. This allowed some widows to continue their late husband's trades and even achieve a degree of independence. However, this was usually contingent upon them not remarrying, as marrying again would transfer control back to their new husbands. Widows who managed to retain their guild rights often did so with significant restrictions and under close supervision by male guild members. Apprenticeships, which were crucial for learning a trade and gaining entry into a guild, were also largely unavailable to women. The few women who did secure apprenticeships were often trained in less lucrative or less respected trades. These apprenticeships were usually arranged by family connections and did not lead to the same opportunities for advancement that male apprentices enjoyed. Number 3. Limited access to education. Women in the medieval age had a tough time when it came to education. Society back then didn't think women needed much schooling, which meant most girls didn't get the chance to learn like the boys did. The general belief was that a woman's place was at home, handling domestic duties and raising children. So instead of learning to read and write, many girls were taught household chores. Noble women were a bit luckier. They sometimes received education at home, learning to read, write, and manage estates. But even for them, the focus was more on skills needed to run a household rather than academic subjects. For example, they might learn some arithmetic for managing household finances or Latin to read religious texts, but they were rarely encouraged to pursue further studies. Peasant women, on the other hand, had almost no access to formal education. Their lives were consumed by hard labor, from working in the fields to managing the home. For these women, every day was about survival, leaving little room or time for education. Reading and writing were luxuries they simply couldn't afford. Monasteries and convents were the few places where some women found a chance to get educated. Nuns were among the most educated women of the time. They could read and write Latin, copy manuscripts, and sometimes even teach other nuns. However, this education was often limited to religious texts and did not extend to broader subjects. One of the few notable exceptions was Hildegard of Bingen, a German Benedictine abbess. She was a writer, composer, philosopher, and visionary. Hildegard's accomplishments were extraordinary, but she was very much the exception rather than the rule. Her story shows that women could achieve great things when given the opportunity, but such chances were extremely rare. The lack of education for women wasn't just about individual knowledge. It also meant that women had limited opportunities to influence society or improve their social status. Without education, they couldn't participate in scholarly or political discussions, write books, or contribute to scientific discoveries. This exclusion perpetuated a cycle of ignorance and oppression, Education for women didn't start to improve significantly until the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Figures like Christine de Pizan began to challenge the status quo. Christine was a writer who advocated for women's education and argued that women were just as capable as men if given the same opportunities. Her works laid some of the groundwork for the future women's rights movements. Number 2, childbirth dangers. Childbirth in the medieval age was incredibly perilous for women. The lack of medical knowledge, poor hygiene, and limited access to proper care made giving birth a life-threatening ordeal. First, let's talk about the dangers of infections. Women often gave birth at home or in unsanitary conditions, increasing the risk of puerperal fever, also known as childbed fever. This bacterial infection could spread rapidly in the absence of sterile techniques and antibiotics. Many women died within days of giving birth due to these infections. Complications during childbirth were another major issue. Without modern medical interventions, problems like obstructed labor could be fatal for both the mother and the baby. Midwives and birthing attendants had limited tools and knowledge to deal with such emergencies. For instance, if a baby was in a breech position, the chances of survival for both mother and child were drastically reduced. Hemorrhaging was another serious danger. In the absence of blood transfusions or advanced surgical techniques, excessive bleeding during or after childbirth often led to death. Medieval medical practices were not equipped to handle severe hemorrhages, leaving many women to bleed out with little to no intervention. Moreover, the lack of prenatal care contributed to the high mortality rates. Women did not have access to regular checkups to monitor the health of their babies and themselves. This meant that conditions like preeclampsia, which causes high blood pressure and can lead to seizures or strokes, were often undiagnosed and untreated. Nutrition played a critical role in the health of pregnant women. Many women in the medieval age did not have access to adequate nutrition, leading to deficiencies that could complicate pregnancies and childbirth. Poor diet weakened their bodies, making them more susceptible to complications and less able to recover from childbirth. Pain management during childbirth was practically non-existent. Women endured excruciating pain without the relief that modern medicine can provide. The fear and stress associated with childbirth could also negatively impact the labor process, leading to further complications. Additionally, the high frequency of pregnancies compounded these dangers. Women were often expected to bear many children, sometimes starting as early as their teenage years. This continuous cycle of pregnancy and childbirth took a severe toll on their bodies. The wear and tear from multiple pregnancies without adequate recovery time increased the risks with each successive childbirth. Stillbirths and infant mortality were tragically common. Many babies did not survive the birthing process or died shortly after birth due to infections, premature birth, or congenital conditions. The emotional and physical toll of losing a child was a heavy burden for many women to bear. Number 1, sumptuary laws. Sumptuary laws in the medieval age were regulations imposed by authorities to control the consumption of luxurious goods, particularly clothing. These laws were designed to reinforce social hierarchies and curb excessive spending, ensuring that people dressed according to their social status. For women, sumptuary laws were particularly restrictive. These laws dictated the colors, fabrics, and even the accessories that women could use. For instance, only noble women could wear luxurious fabrics like silk, velvet, or fur. If a woman from a lower class was caught wearing such materials, she could face severe penalties, including fines and public shaming. The laws varied across different regions, but the intent was always the same: to prevent people from dressing above their social rank. The enforcement of sumptuary laws was often harsh and targeted women disproportionately. A noblewoman flaunting her wealth and status was acceptable, but a common woman attempting to do the same was seen as a threat to the social order. This double standard made it difficult for women to express themselves through fashion, as they had to adhere strictly to what was deemed appropriate for their class. These laws were not just about clothing, but extended to other aspects of personal appearance, including jewelry and hairstyles. For example, a law in England during the late 14th century forbade women of lower classes from wearing gold or silver embroidery and restricted the use of elaborate hairstyles adorned with jewels. The enforcement of sumptuary laws was often strict. Violators could face hefty fines or even have their extravagant garments confiscated. In some severe cases, especially for servants who disobeyed these laws, punishments included public flogging. Sumptuary laws highlight the lengths to which medieval societies went to maintain social order and control women's behavior. These laws were a tool of oppression, limiting women's freedom and reinforcing a rigid social hierarchy that dictated every aspect of their lives. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.